We'll hear argument this morning in case number 14556, Obergefell versus Hodges.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Ms. Bonauto.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court, the intimate and committed relationships of same-sex couples, just like those of heterosexual couples, provide mutual support and are the foundation of family life in our society. Yet the legal commitment, responsibility, and protection that is marriage is off limits to gay people as a class. The stain of unworthiness that follows on individuals and families contravenes the basic constitutional commitment to equal dignity.
The Supreme Court declined to hear Kim Davis's case challenging the Obergefell decision and marriage equality as a constitutional right. But that doesn't mean the attacks on LGBTQ families are over. And those attacks are guaranteed to keep coming in the courts and legislatures, too often cloaked in claims of religious liberty. This week, we'll get expert opinions from one of the 3 attorneys who successfully argued Obergefell in 2015, Mary Bonauto, and her GLADLaw colleague, Ben Marcus.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
We need these voices to be heard now more than ever. Make sure you subscribe, share, and rate The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Taking a minute to do these things really helps other people discover our show and become listeners too. Our library of past conversations includes over 150 hopeful, empowering, and inspiring interviews with guests like Episcopal Bishop Miriam Buddy, Rabbi Sharon Brous, historian Randall Balmer, and many others. You can help grow The State of Belief with a financial contribution right now. Find out how at stateofbelief.com, and you can support and join the work of Interfaith Alliance at interfaithalliance.org. Before we get to this incredible show, I just do want to say I hope for those of you who observed holidays, whether that is Christmas or Hanukkah or winter solstice, whatever you are celebrating, I hope it was beautiful. I hope you had time to be with your loved ones. That can be your family, your chosen family, whoever is around you who brings the light out in them, brings the light out in you, and together shines really bright. And so I hope it was wonderful. This show today is meaningful to me because it's really focusing on some of the heroines of the movement that brought us gay marriage. And I just personally, for me to be able to celebrate Christmas with my husband and my 2 children, and then go to my extended family with all of our cousins and my sister and beloved family, and just have a celebration. And honestly, it is, I have to say, I don't know how to say it aside from, it's just so, it's what my family knows. Like my nieces and nephews, my children, our whole family. There's not a big discussion about our family being, 2 men. It really is just we're part of this family. We're part of our broader family, but then also just part of the human family. And I think what you're going to listen today is really actually like, I'm going to claim it as a holiday theme, which is about like, how do we continue to welcome everyone to be part of that family? So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did, and a very happy holiday to all of you. And now to my guests. Attorney Mary Bonauto first fought for marriage equality in Massachusetts as lead counsel in Goodridge versus Department of Public Health. She won, making that the first state to allow same-sex couples to marry in 2004. In 2015, Mary was one of 3 attorneys who argued before the Supreme Court in Obergefell versus Hodges, leading to the expansion of the right to marry to all 50 states. This past January, she received the Presidential Citizens Medal in a White House ceremony. Also with us, Mary's colleague, Ben Marcus, Senior Constitutional Law Fellow at GLADLaw, the leading LGBTQ+ legal services and civil rights organization. Ben has a deep interest in religion and the law, having attended both Harvard Divinity and Yale Law School. Mary, Ben, thank you so much for joining us on The State of Belief.
Thanks so much for having us.
It's a pleasure.
So we are having this conversation kind of in the echoes, the wake of an effort to go to the Supreme Court by Kim Davis to overturn Obergefell, and that failed kind of surprisingly unanimously, but I don't know what to make of that. And so I just want to start there because it is like the most recent foray against same-sex marriage that we've seen. What did you make of that? And what did you make of the fact that it reached the Supreme Court? Mary, I'll start with you.
Sure. There's so many layers of this, but just to do a really high level, she's the one clerk that we know of in the entire nation that asserted that the Supreme Court's decision wasn't clear about her obligation as a clerk in Kentucky to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. And so on that basis, she refused. Ultimately, she instructed her whole entire office to refuse licenses to same-sex couples. And so she really ended up not doing her job and taking the law into her own hands to prescribe how others should act. And I have to say, she went to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals 3 times. Nobody would ever accuse that court of being a wildly liberal court, and it's ruled against her each time. And so I think initially her claim really was about trying to get some sort of First Amendment exemption. And I think the Sixth Circuit had explored that and said there were other ways to do this, but not what you did here. And so in the end, when you try to tee up a challenge to Obergefell, which was raised quite belatedly, I will just say, so it didn't have a chance to percolate to the courts, and it wouldn't have anyway. But when you bring it up at that late stage and so on and so forth, they weren't going to wrap their minds around it. It wasn't teed up properly to say okay, now it's time we're going to revisit Obergefell, when she had essentially, her attorneys really had just sort of made a mess of things for many years. But the other thing is, we're not in that conference, so we don't know what they discussed. I think everyone saw that couples were extremely concerned about the idea of their marriages evaporating. We happen to believe that existing marriages are protected, and that marriage, as the institution it is for people in general, should remain so.
Yeah.
For the same reasons we wouldn't take marriage from anybody else. But people were quite nervous about it. You even saw justices like Justice Barrett, giving a long interview saying there's a lot of reliance interest in marriage. Justice Gorsuch talking about the idea of a marriage contract, and that's something that people rely on. So I think there's a lot of brew here, and we don't know what it all is. I will say that one of the early signs for us that this case sort of had a little bit of a mark on it from the perspective of people who would like to see Obergefell reversed, was that when she filed her cert petition, there were not briefs of sort of the typical organizations supporting her, the ones who really do try to roll back LGBTQ rights and so on. They just didn't come in.
Right.
So it wasn't just us. Other people had figured out that perhaps there were some problems with the case.
Color me conspiracy theory, but the fact that none of the justices even entertained it, there was unanimous, made me think, okay, well, yes, good that this this didn't go further than it did, but it also doesn't mean to me that this is over. I mean, this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you both, is that I do feel in my own marriage, and in many of our friends' marriages, and there is a creeping uncertainty, and which is a terrible way to live, and so it's one thing for this to be pushed back, but it's certainly on my mind, and Ben, I want to talk to you about this, is the fact that the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant organization, passed a resolution that one of their primary goals is to roll back Obergefell and same-sex marriage. And so I am interested in how putting on your Harvard Divinity plus Yale Law plus GLADLaw hat, how you understand this in the context of the religious reality that we're living through.
Thanks, Paul. I want to start by saying something that you know very clearly, which is that not all religious folks are against same-sex marriage or LGBT rights, that there are queer religious folks, there are straight religious folks who are strong allies of the LGBT rights movement. So we just want to be very clear that this isn't an oppositional LGBT rights versus religious freedom conversation. GLADLaw has a proud history of being sensitive to the concerns of religious people and working with religious communities on LGBT rights issues. It is also true that there is renewed interest among some religious folks in the United States to contest not only same-sex marriage, but an array of priorities for folks who are concerned with queer rights and queer interests. That's not so surprising. I think as we see advances in a variety of civil rights movements, there's always a period of contestation. As things move forward, there are those who would like to see them either stop or roll back. It's important to name that there are a lot of major religious denominations in the United States who have, since Obergefell, come to celebrate LGBT relationships, queer relationships, and same-sex marriage in particular. So it's not a one-way story that sort of we're moving backward only. There's real, in my mind, progress within different religious communities that are having difficult conversations about who are we and how do we care for queer congregants. So
I really just want to say I appreciate that so much, and it's actually something that we have to keep on saying and saying and saying, because I do think, like, there are groups who are invested in this idea that this is an as you say, oppositional moment, like, that there's LGBTQ rights and then there's religious rights, and those are completely separate. And we have to keep on saying over and over again, actually, the majority of religious folks in America support LGBTQ equality. The majority of religious folks support marriage equality.
Can I just add in here,
Yeah.
just as you wouldn't expect that all different sex couples have a particular religious framework, it's just so clear from the many people we've represented over the years, including at the Supreme Court, that there are plenty of same-sex couples who are religious, and their faiths are absolutely fundamental to themselves as a person and to their family and to their marriage. And obviously, they are in congregations or faith traditions that are able to support them, which is lovely. And, marriage has been historically religious, and it's absolutely been a civil thing, to quote back in the day. And it's been that duality has persisted. So I think we live with that duality and people wanting to emphasize one part or another, but you see it in the lives of real people where both coexist.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think one of the things that I was really interested in hearing from both of you, and again, thank you so much. It's like talking to LGBTQ / religion rights royalty. You two, I am interested in how you view at this moment the lay of the land of same-sex marriage, in part because it's percolating in the States. We hear it from various folks. They just can't handle it. And then we have Respect for Marriage Act, but how does that factor in? So maybe if you wanted to give us a little bit of how you view this question in play right now, especially given the background of kind of this Christian nationalist moment that we're living in.
So I want to start with a statement that, as a queer advocate, and I'm speaking for myself, not for GLADLaw, but I think this is shared by GLADLaw. I strongly believe in religious freedom as a core fundamental right within the United States. The First Amendment is vital to the democratic process. There's a scholar I really love, this idea that he has that the First Amendment represents the life cycle of a democratic idea. We need religious freedom because it allows us to develop theories of the good in our own communities and then to express that to our neighbors and then to try to bring that to our government and have our ideas represented in our government policies. I believe strongly in religious freedom. There is a talking point. I understand it, that religious freedom right now is in service to a particular political or religious agenda. I hear that. I do think it's important, though, for all of us to go back to first principles about why we have religious freedom and why it's important. The second thing I'll say is one thing that we recognize is that we are just living through a changing legal landscape. The Supreme Court has been changing doctrine on religious freedom through a variety of cases, some of which are directly about LGBT rights and some of which aren't. But we're seeing a change in what it means for a neutral and generally applicable law, how that's analyzed by the Supreme Court when it burdens religious practice in cases like Tandon v. Newsom and Fulton v. City of Philadelphia. Fulton, of course, dealt with an LGBT rights issue related to foster care. We're seeing changes in the recent case Mahmoud v. Taylor related to religion and the ability to direct the religious upbringing of a child. That was a case implicating LGBT rights to the extent that a school was including curriculum that exposed students to the diversity of families within their schools, including LGBT families. And also, I want to point out that a lot of cases that are lumped in with religious freedom cases, because they involve religious claimants, are actually, as a doctrinal matter, formally a free speech case. And those are cases like 303 Creative, which was actually a case about what the court called pure speech. That was the case in Colorado related to a website designer who didn't want to make a website for same-sex marriage because she said it was forcing her to speak against her own beliefs. And then we have a case right now before the Supreme Court, Charles v. Salazar, related to conversion therapy, that the therapist is devoutly religious, but it's formally a free speech case. So we are seeing a changing landscape. The court is changing legal doctrine. And what our concern is just how do we operate in this changing legal landscape? Also recognizing that as the landscape changes, when court sets doctrine, it has to apply to all cases. The facts might change, but the legal principle has to apply. And so we are seeing that some advocates for causes like reproductive rights are using changing legal doctrine to advocate for their own interests. There's a great little article by the state court report about the variety of cases being brought by religious claimants who seek access to reproductive services, including abortion care, using religious freedom claims under new doctrine that the court is setting. So the through line is a changing legal landscape that, for the purposes of this conversation, often involves religious claimants on these First Amendment claims, but that sometimes they're religious freedom claims and sometimes they're free speech claims, and that the doctrine as it's being set anew, sort of by the Supreme Court, has affected negatively, in some cases, the interests of LGBT individuals and communities, but that doctrine, what remains to be seen is how it will apply when, in, again, the cases of this conversation, queer religious claimants are bringing claims for their own religious freedom or their own free speech rights.
Right. That's fair. Thank you. Mary, what would you add to that?
Well, a few things. One is I appreciate that Ben raised the non-discrimination cases, the public accommodation cases, like the website designer and the Fulton case with the Catholic Social Services not wanting to to home studies and so on for same-sex couples when they were contracted with Philadelphia and so on. And I raise it because in those cases, which, to be clear, like, we briefed in them and we were briefing again on the other side, okay? But again, I think in a hopefully sensitive way, but just like we can't just gut non-discrimination laws. And interestingly, in those cases, what you see, I think, is a trend right now at the court, and it's not a comfortable trend for any of us, but it seems to be a trend where both the court wants to protect both religious liberty and it wants to provide protection for, gay persons and same-sex couples. And that's leading to some seeming like, awkward decisions, like in Masterpiece Cake Shop, with the baker who didn't wanna make the cake. Um, in the end, this kind of thing had been addressed decades ago, like, your views don't allow you an exemption from a non-discrimination law. However, in that case, because there was hostility expressed by some people in the course of the administrative proceedings of the case, the court said this was based on religious hostility, therefore the baker wins. So that wasn't a broad ruling, although I will say that that kind of idea of hostility is something that people still haven't wrapped their mind around, like, just keep it to yourself. It's not really helpful in any kind of, like, adjudicatory process or legislative process to be demonizing people this way. So anyway, that's one thing, but I see that tension. And you brought up the Respect for Marriage Act, and I think the Respect for Marriage Act is interesting too because, it really did try to maintain the status quo. Right now, at that point, 2022, same-sex couples may marry. They may travel from state to state. They, you cannot deny the same protections and responsibilities as any other married couple would receive. That's the baseline, and they did protect it. And part of what was so interesting about that was, when it first came up in the House, I think 40 Republicans voted for it. And then some people wanted to slow the process down and get into the Senate and perhaps, you know, bury it in amendments. But in the end, that sort of both sides are gonna be protected here. We're gonna just keep things the way they are. You can't use this in religious liberty arguments. It's just about protecting marriage as it exists, state to state, and not just same-sex couples, but no discrimination based on race, ethnicity, as well. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is I'm seeing that duality, and when it came time for the Senate to vote on this, I will tell you, like, the LDS Church, which had opposed, had supported Proposition 8 in California to undo California's marriage equality ruling. They were right there. They were major supporters.
Yeah.
And Mitt Romney, Senator Mitt Romney, who had been governor of Massachusetts when we won marriage here, who'd been implacably opposed in every way, and brought a lot of people to come visit Massachusetts to make that happen. He voted for this law and
Yeah.
said, like, I esteem and love all my fellow Americans equally. All I'm trying to say is that things have changed to some degree, but they haven't
Yeah.
changed totally because we live in the United States and people are going to have different views, and particularly on religion. But I'm seeing that what is happening is some sort of the court, and I think some people trying to have like a live and let live idea where both of these things are important and they have to coexist. And I think we're in this period of trying to make that work out as opposed to any kind of winner takes all. And
Okay.
it makes sense to me that we would be there, and it's actually a better place to be than some others. There are certainly people who want to undo it, no doubt about it. But I'm not sure that everybody feels that way. I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
not everybody feels that way.
Up next, much more with Mary Bonauto and Ben Marcus. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe, share, and rate The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. My guests are Mary Bonauto and Ben Marcus from GLADLaw. Well, you both are talking me down off a ledge. I mean, I'm very sky is falling, and I think that there are a lot of people. I would say couples who are like, what is really happening? But it feels to me that you're saying that it is possible that we will maintain same sex marriage. But do you think it's also possible that different states will be able to reverse it? That feels to me like the most likely, like send it back to the states, kind of Roe v. Wade. That's at least what some people are saying. Certainly Hillary Clinton famously said that. I don't know
Right.
that she's not. I don't know if that was helpful or not, but that was certainly the way she viewed the law. But then you also have a couple of the justices again talking about that wouldn't work, and also. Are there things that we should be doing, religious folks could be doing, to ensure that we don't have a reversal?
I wish I had that crystal ball. All I will say is that I think there's awfully good reasons to keep it, because nobody wants their family to be a political football. There's so much at stake. It's the most important relationship in life to people. And to have that become a contested political issue after people having those protections is it's kind of unthinkable. And when you just accept the fact that, 21 years ago, people started seeing people marry in Massachusetts, and 10 years nationwide, and like people say it's good for kids, it's protection for families. And then when you think even harder, you see how it rolls out across society. Employers, businesses, and so on, and every institution in some way uses marriage as a reference point. So to actually say just this one group of people is shoved out of that again, when we have a decision from the Supreme Court saying this is the right to marry, we've had it a long time and we've included more people in it along the way. And when you also add in something that wasn't in Dobbs, by the way, wasn't in the abortion decision about equal protection, we have very good legal arguments, and you could even set aside the legal arguments and say, look at the impact on people's lives. Are you really going to tear this away from people when it provides good to them, their families, their communities, and the broader society?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm compelled by it. I hope others are. I know that same-sex marriage is not the only thing that you all work on, and I am curious. You two both are so versed in the law and more broadly, the premier organization working on LGBTQ equality through legal means. What are some of the priorities that you're looking at right now, especially, I would say, as some of our trans siblings are feeling the great threat and erasure, and others? I'm curious, what are the ways you're understanding, how to spend your time right now?
Sure. I mean, at one point, I remember being told to my face that I was a criminal because I was a lesbian. And, a lot of stereotypes about gay people, LGBT people. And what can I say? It's hard not to see the same kind of thing coming out in great force now, where there's actually really targeting going on of transgender people. So, employment, housing protections that existed, the right to, no, the ability to get health care that is medically necessary for you, or if you're a parent for your child. Um, Pretty wild what is happening out there. And, to have a executive order about K-12 schools and making sure that you don't respect a child, and their gender, their transgender status. When a parent has come in and said, "This is who my kid is," it's just anyway. So right now, it is very hard for trans people to sort of exist as they are in public, and I do think that currently the government is trying to make it impossible for people to be who they are, um, and make it very hard to live. And I say this with great sadness, and maybe some people think it's an overstatement, but boy, we have so much litigation going on now, and so do others. Stripping funding, stripping research, stripping websites, saying this doesn't matter anymore. We're going to roll back everything, is is something. So yeah, right now, I think for me, um, every opportunity that people get to stand up for the basic humanity and dignity of every individual is important. For me, in my own faith, that's just a central tenet. And being a lot less judgmental and, understanding, um, we're all here and meant to coexist. So, anyway, it's full on right now is all
Yeah,
I can say. And so we are all compelled, we feel as a legal organization compelled to use those tools to try to do something about it. And I will just say, like, just as you continue to read about people who are implacably opposed to homosexuality coming to a different perspective because it's their child, the same has happened in families all across the nation with respect to having transgender children. And I hope that more of those voices will come forward. And I think it's okay for people to say, I don't understand this. This is not something that's in my world experience, but I do understand basic human dignity. And people should all be able to find a way to live in this world.
I thank you so much. That is perfectly said. It is unfathomable to me, like how this became just this rallying cry. And part of the reason it became a super rallying cry was the effectiveness that it was viewed as a political tool. And so, when you have the Republican Party spending $250 million on ads targeting trans people, then eventually you are able to dehumanize them in such a way. And it just being at Stonewall when they just took away transgender from the website, I was like, how are you doing this? And then they just one thing after another. And I have many, many friends, clergy friends, who have transgender kids, and they it has been really moving to watch them, how their heart had to open in order to care for their child. Like they were, and it just seems like this crazy government overreach over, like, for those who are always talking about small government, to insist that these parents don't know their children and what their children need. And so it really is, it's heartbreaking. And I do think this is somewhere where religious language that you just evoked at the end of what you were talking about, your own church, and the way just around dignity and about love and respect. Ben, how are you understanding, specifically with the attack on trans people, both from your religious lens as well as your legal one?
I think because Mary and I are lawyers working at a legal organization, we've been talking a lot about law, and that makes sense. And there certainly are opportunities for lawyers to work with religious communities to get the perspectives of religious communities in front of courts so that they have more context for this conversation when things are often presented as oppositional, trans rights versus um, religious freedom or something, that it's important for courts to hear a different perspective. But courts aren't the only venue in which we're having these conversations. This is a much wider conversation happening in our own communities, whether it's at school board meetings or it's at town hall meetings, or it's in your home. We're coming up to Thanksgiving and people have these kinds of conversations at home, trying to make sense of the news. And it's true that a lot of folks don't know or don't know that they know trans folks in their personal lives. So this can feel like a very um, abstract discussion for many people. And I think religious communities as places where people gather to talk about our values, what matters to us, what's most important, are spaces where we can model the kinds of conversations that we hope that people have about our neighbors, about people in our own families, about ourselves. Um, it's just very important for religious communities to recognize that there is a conversation that needs to happen outside of courts to help people understand why this matters, why it's and the language that they might use will differ, obviously, based on the religious communities that they come out of. I think of the language of being created in the image of God. And what does that mean? What does it mean to really approach the trans folks who are in our lives, understanding that they're created in the image of God? It's an entirely different vocabulary, an entirely different way of talking about these issues that will connect with folks on a much deeper level than the kinds of conversations that we are forced to have as lawyers when presenting a legal argument to a court. And we also know that judges exist in the world and they understand the world through the variety of experiences that they have. And as much as judges try to separate their personal opinion from the decisions that they render, and they use a language of law, they see the world around them and the conversations that are happening. We know that for many judges, religion is an important part of their lives. And so religious communities can play a, a key role in a different kind of parallel conversation to the legal conversation to help folks understand why what's happening to trans folks is such a in my mind, like a perversion of the gospel. And so that's, I think, one role that religious communities can play.
Yeah, I think part of the again, I'll just like the specter in the room, the kind of white Christian nationalism and this idea that underneath it around gender roles and like what for some people feels like, I just feel like there's a resurgence. I don't know if it's a resurgence, maybe it's always been there, but about like what women can do, what men can do, what is allowed. And I do think like if you come out of that mindset, the idea of trans is just it subverts that paradigm so strongly in all different ways. And so there's just incredible resistance to it, but and I hope that those of us who are in other religious communities can speak up. I mean, it's really something that I personally feel so passionate about, and we're and again, like I feel like this is another example of just going after the people who are most marginalized and using them as scapegoats. And I don't know that there's not one solution to this, but I do think the more we talk about it and the more we lift it up as a priority, the better the future will look. What other issues are rising to the fore? Like what other ways are you at GLADLaw thinking about the next years? Do you all do anything on how elections function, or how, like, I'm not sure the expanse of the issues that you take up, but what are some of the other areas regarding LGBTQ equality that you are looking at, Mary?
Well, another important part of our work is around protection for families, married and unmarried, because we believe that the people who bring a kid into the world, or the people who are raising that child, sometimes are the same people, really need to have a secure parent-child relationship. So we've always been very protective of families, and that's something that we do across the country. And families are important to LGBTQ people in every way. Um, so that's part of it. Another focus of our effort has always been around schools. Schools are community institutions, sometimes the largest community institution in a geographic area, and a place where people come together, and everyone has to belong, and public schools are for everyone. And then to ask schools to live up to that can sometimes be a challenge, and particularly when it's come to how students treat other students, or what it is that the adults in the room will call out. Because it's astonishing the number of LGBT students, and I'm talking about gay students and trans students, who have to be educated at home because they aren't safe at school. And it's still the case that there are so many young people who are raised to be ashamed of who they are. And, other kids have learned that too. And so I think the targeting, the bullying are quite intense. And it's not limited to LGBTQ people, but it's, again, you really see it with the kids who are being, tutored and so on. So the idea of equal educational opportunity is something hugely important in my family's life, like the idea of, like, being able to succeed at school, and that's your road through life. You want that for every kid. We want that for every child, and
Yeah.
not to pull back because they're gay and they have a disability, or you know, they're trans, or whatever it might be. And so that we really spend a lot of time on school policy and with and against school lawyers, and sticking up for children and trying to get education out there. And we constantly write these know your rights publications that are, you know, something that a lawyer would love, but like we want everybody to know the law and that it's on their side. And that they can advocate for their children at school. We care a lot about the teachers and the people in the schools too, who are increasingly asked to do just broader and broader and broader jobs. And, amazing human beings by and large who really try to meet that mandate with so little support. So anyway, those are among the many other areas. But on the religion piece, I just wanted to say that because of what's been coming to the court and what's out there in public advocacy is, increasingly we're, addressing, um, the issues like around government funding of religion. And I understand that's where the court is, and that is a lot more about where the law is. Then the thing that is sort of sometimes difficult to sit with or that we're still processing is what that then means for non-discrimination laws. Because very often with government money comes requirements not to discriminate, including as to LGBTQ people. We are involved in a lot of that litigation and weighing in on that and not wanting there to be an exemption from non-discrimination mandates when everyone else is subject to those non-discrimination mandates. So it comes up whether it's social services, whether it's private schools. It comes up even with sports associations when, you have high school athletics and there's religious schools in the area and they don't want to play. If there's a trans athlete, they get kicked out, they sue, they win. It's, I guess for our society, this is Mary Bonauto speaking, not GLAD, okay? Like, I don't want a two-track society. I want everybody to have like a common understanding of their rights and responsibilities and not have this like special, anyway, what feels like sometimes like, why does only one group get an exemption? And there are reasons for that. People would tell me, and I understand around the importance of faith in people's lives. I think there are other things that are important too. And I don't know that we've come to the right balance on that yet.
Yeah. I mean, I have two kids in public school and, I feel so fortunate, because I live in a city and but the way I talk about it is like, you don't have to agree with us on everything. You don't even have to, honestly, you don't have to agree with my family, but we can live side by side and we can actually interact and maybe we'll get to know one another and maybe like we'll learn from one another and maybe we can still be neighbors and we can still, but to divorce, this fragmentation, almost like I refuse to be in community with you I think feels so dangerous and feels like, and one of the things you said, which it really had not occurred to me and I really appreciate it. I don't know if you have any numbers on this, but how many children have to be homeschooled because their school is too hostile for them to even exist there, which is like so terrible and such like a heartbreaking idea. And of course it makes sense that is happening, but if we don't all feel like outraged by that and the fact that we can't create, and again, I'm not pointing the fingers necessarily at teachers for sure, because I think teachers often try as much as they can, but atmospheres can be so hostile. And I really appreciate you bringing up families. I appreciate you bringing up schools. This is something, again, that Interfaith Alliance has been working a lot on. We just launched an organization, like a broad organizational principle, religious freedom in public schools, which is really about making sure that everyone has the rights in public schools to be fully themselves and that no one's. And the other thing you didn't mention, which is true, like vouchers often like take money out of public schools, but then they go to places where they have the ability to refuse people. Like, those are often for private schools that can say, well, we don't, we're definitely not going to take a queer kid, but we're, not only that, we're not going to take a low performing child, or we're not going to take the wrong religion. They can do what they want. But public money going to these voucher programs is, I think, a real danger. Ben, that was really helpful from Mary. I can imagine you having lots of thoughts about those various areas and what what piques your particular interest in what Mary was saying?
So I'll speak for myself now that, a lot of these cases involving anti-discrimination law and access to funds um, or those who are seeking exemptions to anti-discrimination law end up in a realm of constitutional scrutiny that requires a court to consider a few things. One is the sincerity of the religious belief. Is the person who's claiming the exemption actually sincere? Another question is this actually a substantial burden on their religious belief? And then another question is whether if there is a substantial burden on a sincerely held belief, whether there's a compelling state interest there. For a variety of reasons, because those are the tools that we have in the law, advocates for anti-discrimination law have argued all three: sincerity of the belief, whether there's a substantial burden, and the compelling state interest. And then there's another piece that I'm not going to get into. The Supreme Court has signaled, I think, and maybe I'm reading this wrong, that there's less of an interest in adjudicating the sincerity of the belief or whether there's a substantial burden. And I have personal beliefs about whether I think really courts it's within the judicial ken, whether it's right for judges to adjudicate sincerity of belief or how substantial a burden is. I recognize why those are important parts of the legal analysis. I think it can get very challenging and often leads to discounting the claims of folks from minority religious communities when that happens. Putting that aside, the reality is that more of the work now seems to be at this level of compelling state interest. And I just think it has to be the case that protecting anti-discrimination law is a compelling state interest, even if there is a substantial burden on a sincerely held belief. We just, as a multi-religious, multiracial, plus society, we have to be able to enforce laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of these protected classes. Because otherwise, how do we live together? And I think we as advocates need to be more, again, this is my view speaking, be more clear about the fact that we might be burdening other people when we enforce anti-discrimination law, but that is the burden of living in a multiracial, multi-religious democracy. That's just what it takes, is sometimes we are burdened, but that what is good for the goose is good for the gander. I mean, it's good for all of us when we enforce anti-discrimination law, because in some community somewhere, you're going to be a minority and you're going to want the protection of anti-discrimination law. And that's just so vital. And I worry sometimes gets lost in the conversation when people, especially in the court of public opinion, are saying, well, this person's not sincere. It's obviously just a cover for X, Y, or Z, or it's not really a burden on their belief. I get why that conversation happens, but it seems that it's never going to satisfy our opponent. Our opponents will never feel heard if we just dismiss their, I think, often honest, sincere feeling of burden. And we should be just forthright about why we still advocate for anti-discrimination law.
Yeah, my first instinct after I think it was the website case, was like, okay, like what would be to stop a pagan from like saying, I'm not going to do any Christian websites. That's just, I know that's like me being immature, but it is, I can imagine, like me, like when do we just stop doing things for each other? Because, when do we just say, okay, I absolutely not. No, gross. No. And I refuse, and I will go to the mat for this. And my religious tradition absolutely, makes that anathema to me. I do think like do we really want to live in that world where we're just saying, I'm not going to serve you. I'm not going to do anything with you because, I've just decided what you believe is so disgusting to me and so, against my soul that I just can't do that. And I do think that I wrote a piece long ago. I don't even remember when it was. I think it was back in Arizona. Maybe it was Cake Shop. I can't remember. Anyway, it was like, what did it call it? Sincerely held beliefs in the fraying of America. And the idea that these sincerely held beliefs could be used just to tear us apart is like a terrible idea. And so part of that is like our beliefs have to be better, frankly. We have to make our beliefs better. Like we have to like, and that's not for the court to decide. That's for religious folks, right? To say like, yeah, actually, bigotry is a terrible belief to have, even if it's sincerely held. And we're not gonna. That's. I'm speaking as a person, as myself, but as a religious leader. Like sometimes we need to call off beliefs as bad beliefs. And right now, that certainly is the case. I feel like both of you are. I just love this conversation, and I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on TV in the sense that like my dad was a law professor. I'm surrounded by the law, and so I just love geeking out on the law. But is there any? Let me ask it this way: What is what would you encourage people like me, religious communities, to do right now, to be about? What business should we be about right now, so that when cases are coming into the legal realm, you feel you are stronger because religious folks have done their work, specifically around LGBTQ rights? Ben, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Mary.
There are different paths to take, and I think it depends on the appetite of the religious community, on their resources, on a variety of factors. And all of the paths are helpful. So one path might be to use the special gifts of religious communities to speak with those within the community and beyond the community about why LGBT rights matter in the vernacular of the community, not trying to play lawyers, but being authentic to who they are and using that prophetic voice to say, here is what it means to do justice, to be righteous, to care for our neighbors, to care for the least of these, to care for those who are most marginalized. And I think that is an essential role, because that's really where change happens, is within communities. It doesn't have, courts often come at the end of a long movement within civil society, including within religious communities, about what justice looks like. And courts might be kind of a capstone recognizing a change in public consciousness. But the real work happens in community. And I just think it can't be discounted. I think religious communities, especially those that care about LGBT rights, I know that they're thinking this, and from my experience, queer religious folks feel particularly hurt when the voices of queer religious people are ignored or obscured, and these conversations are just presented as LGBT rights versus religion, because it does deep harm to those who are religious, who have found ways of not just reconciling, but recognizing that to be religious and queer is entirely compatible, that they're mutually those parts of themselves mutually inform and strengthen one another. And so when that perspective, that experience is denied, that's harmful. So if religious communities can lift up those voices to make it clear that this is part of the conversation, that's critical. And then to those religious communities that have resources and interest in working with lawyers to tell the story in courts about how they feel about these issues, why this impacts them. Amici briefs can do a variety of things. Amici briefs are briefs that are submitted not by parties to a case, but by those who might have some interest in the case or feel that they can inform the court about a matter important to them that bears on the case. Amici briefs, can make nice legal arguments that help the court interpret sort of the or analyze the discrete legal questions before the court. But sometimes a really important role that amici briefs can play is providing background, just helping the court understand who does this affect? What are the stakes here? What values are at play? And religious communities might play a role, especially when cases involve questions of religion and religious freedom. So there's a lot of paths I think that are open to religious communities, but I just wouldn't discount the path that lays outside the court. I think there's often kind of a, a, a fetishization of like legal work that is somehow special and particularly meaningful or important. But I would say, especially religious communities should know that that's not the case, that there's like something really important that's happening outside of our governmental institutions.
Thank you, Ben. Mary.
I thought that was beautiful. So I appreciate that overview and forest, if you will, of ways of thinking about this. Maybe I'll just mention a tree for a moment, which is just to go back to schools. I think as Ben said, I think it's really important that every group, congregation, whatever, like have its own authentic process and speak in its own voice about what it wants to do, try to figure that out. How do they engage, more broadly in their communities? I mean, I will say that right now, the hottest tickets in town are school board meetings. So much is happening, and that's even more so now, given the Mahmoud decision from the Supreme Court, which, as Ben was talking about, does reaffirm that it's schools that decide the curriculum, but also is saying parents, you can opt your kids out of things if, well, I don't want to get overboard here, but there can be times there can be an opt-out process, if a particular type of instruction is, contrary to the values that you're trying to instill in your child, bringing them into faith. So knowing this is going to be another larger dimension of school board meetings. And I have just decided to try to put a positive spin on it and think about this as an opportunity for democracy and to hear each other out as parents, because you all care about the success of children, your own children, and the community and the school. You want it to be good. And so I'm just going to say that having voices come in to sort of cut through it sometimes. Here's what are we talking about here? And we're talking about what should be taught in the schools. They are for everyone. They are. Everybody belongs here. And, you mentioned some religious schools not wanting LGBTQ kids. Yeah. Well, sometimes they also don't want kids of LGBTQ parents. But by contrast, the public schools are for everyone.
Right.
So I do wonder about the possibility sometimes of people who spend more time thinking about values and their commitment and the dignity and respect that all people deserve coming into some of those fora and getting a chance to raise their hand and say, the way I see it is, and I'm not going to say what they would say, but I think that will be really helpful, because I've been part of those meetings sometimes, around policies and this and that. And it's just so helpful when somebody comes in with that clarity to just remind everybody in the end what this is all about.
Thank you for that. Both of you, I love the forest and the tree. And that tree is so important. And it really is, I think that message is getting through. And what we're, I live in Manhattan, and we found there, we weren't paying attention to our local school board, and for our district. And some people got elected from kind of Moms for Liberty types, and they passed an anti-trans resolution. All of a sudden, everybody looked up and said, "Wait, what happened?" With all that we have to worry about that was something that they did. And so we a lot of us went up there, and I went up there as a religious leader and as a parent, and said, "This just doesn't represent what we want our schools to be about." They fortunately were voted out of the next time because people were aware, and people were began to be okay. And so I think that that's really important. And I do want to brag for a second just in front of both of you, because you said it's important for religious folks who are also queer to kind of make their presence known. And the Advocate put out a list of queer clergy fighting Christian nationalism. And there I was on the list at the very top. And so I'm calling it like the number one gay. But it wasn't actually in any chronological order. I just happened to be on the list. But it was very, it was a nice idea I thought it was really important that the Advocate viewed that as an important thing to recognize. And I do think that sometimes we go into LGBTQ activist circles and they view their relationship with religion as adversarial when it doesn't have to be, in fact. Like there are allies on the table there that you're leaving. and I think the opportunity is for a much more, collaborative understanding. Mary Bonauto is GLADLaw's Senior Director of Civil Rights and Legal Strategies. Ben Marcus is Senior Constitutional Law Fellow at GLADLaw. These are two of the most amazing people in America. I am so honored to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much for being on The State of Belief.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I've enjoyed the conversation a lot.
Who do you know who would get a lot out of this discussion? Please share The State of Belief with them and be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. We need your help to continue growing The State of Belief. Please make a financial contribution today at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.